Hi and welcome to DataFix, brought to you by IndiaSpend, a data journalism initiative. I'm Alison, and today author Tripti Lahiri joins me to discuss her new book, Made in India. The book chronicles the lives of women who form a significant part of urban India's unorganized sector. In fact, in the decade after liberalization, their numbers grew 120%. They are the domestic help who for years work in more affluent homes, performing basic tasks their employers have no time for or simply would prefer not to do. Still, at the end of the day, these women, sometimes barely of legal age, struggle to earn salaries that are often found to be much below the minimum wage. We learn all this and more in Made in India as Tripti shares more. Hi, Tripti. Hi, welcome to DataFix. I'd like to start with asking you about the dynamics, the changing dynamics between employers and maids. Aspirations and expectations are now changing between employers and employees. I just want to understand from your research, what have you found out about this?
I guess this week it might not seem that there's been a lot of change, especially when we see clashes between employers and their help. But I would say that when I did my reporting, I did find that there were people who fully expected their children to become white collar and have a more egalitarian relationship with their employers. And I also felt that there were employers who did want to have a better relationship with their health, not be so top down. So I did see those kinds of changes happening. I also did see a lot of both very good and very bad relationships at wages in place across the city.
Okay. And in the book, you say to be a servant in India today is in many ways an enterprise with a much more uncertain outcome than in the past. What part of your research led you to say this?
I guess in the past, which is also when people would use the word servants, we don't really say that anymore, but I use it at times in the book, especially to talk about sort of what seems to me the more unequal relationships. I think in the past, people really didn't have a lot of money, and there was understanding that if they could come to the city and have housing and food, and then maybe have their husband be able to work for money elsewhere, that was pretty much, I think, what people expected that time, or maybe a very low salary. I think now, you might come to the city and you might be a very young person, as you mentioned, and end up in a household where you don't speak the language, you're not of the same religion, you have no cultural experience to share with them, and be possibly treated quite badly, because I do think that having such different people together in a household isn't always a great recipe for living harmoniously together. But there are also people who are able to get jobs for, people who are two-income families and who are willing to pay more and pay for education, and they might end up in a very different situation by the time the next generation is born and grows up. And in that sense, I think people don't know, am I going to end up in the sort of middle class, or is my family going to go in a different direction?
Okay. And I understand that there is a microeconomy at work when it comes to the wages of domestic workers. What the neighborhood pays generally dictates how much these women earn. But you mentioned since the British Raj, wage rates of domestic help have not kept up with changing times. In fact, they were paid more back in the day. Could you put this in perspective for us?
So basically, that's sort of based on one comparison. I think some people do a lot more research to really say whether, taking into account inflation, have wages stayed the same or have they maybe gone up a bit? I think that I wouldn't be surprised to find out that if you look at, say, the raw family wages, which are documented well, and then compare them to a billionaire family today, very well you might find that they're the same. What I had looked at was a housekeeping manual that was kept by during the colonial sort of Raj by two British maids to tell other people who were, in the colonial administration how to pay their Indian health. So they had offered various wage scales, like 9 rupees for a cook. And, using a very basic online inflation calculator, that came to about 5,000 rupees in 2006. And so in 2000, I know that a lot of people in Delhi, especially in Maid In India, where my parents live, were paying about that as a monthly wage. And so that's what made me sort of think, oh, see, these wages have not real terms, but up in over a century.
Yeah, 9 and 5,000 is a vast difference.
Well, but yet, then actually that 9 becomes 5,000 in, I mean, that's an inflationary increase. That's not a real increase.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to go on to talk about your relationship with your own maid when you were living in Delhi. And you mentioned in the book that in many ways she improved you as a person. Could you tell us a little more about that relationship?
Yeah, I would say this was the first time that I hired a domestic ever as an adult. I've either not had any experienced sort of the benefits of my parents' domestic help when I was either living with them or visiting them. And so that's a very different relationship. It's a much less dense relationship because you're not really the employer. They know they don't actually have to do what you want, and so and you don't pay their wages, and so in some ways you can have a much better relationship. So I think when I first had to hire someone, I've never been an employer to anyone, and I really didn't have a good sense of the schedule of when things should happen. I wasn't paying attention to, when is a raise owed, how much should the raise be, what are other expectations she might have of me. I had my expectations of her, and I didn't put much thought into what might her expectations be and how should I fulfill them. And I think she, in very diplomatic ways, would come and say, oh, do you think I've been working with you, this much time, shouldn't you consider the raise question? And I think that also the way that she would try to handle it if if I was irritable, which like a lot of people in India, you do perhaps talk to your help in a way that you wouldn't talk to your co-worker, certainly not your boss, And there's this the feeling that you, even at a conscious level, you might think I shouldn't do it, but I bet most people do it, and I know that I've done it. And I know that one time when I was really cross with her and completely sort of out of line, raising my voice, and she said to me, "Look, if you're really that cross, maybe you should just give me a slap." And, and that really sort of stops me from speaking further.
Yeah, and I think even the way you wrote about that in the book, the sort of shock that you get when someone says, maybe you should just give me a slap. I mean, that really shook you and sort of gave you the understanding of a kind of dynamic that is also at play when you sort of are engaged in that as an employer, in that sense.
Yeah, and so I think she was really, in a very smart way, was telling me, look, you're already so imbalanced in power. You already have so much power in this relationship over me that is it really necessary for you to exert it in this imperial way. I think by saying this thing that seemed very submissive, she really made me think about what I was doing and feel really terrible and really think she was right to say that.
Okay. And so has your employment policy with domestic help now changed? After working on the book and interacting with all these women, what has changed?
I think I just try to be a bit more mindful about, maybe I don't have to get the very best deal out of the relationship. Like if I'm paying a little bit more than what others around me are paying, maybe it's okay. And maybe there's always going to be somebody at the higher end of the range or the lower end of the range in terms of how much you pay. Maybe that person can be me, right? And I also think one thing I realized is that there are people who actually do a lot and work in a lot more than me in terms of sort of helping people with paperwork or savings or buying a house. And I kind of realized, we're always putting ourselves against the lower end of the scale, and we don't want to think that we're paying more than others. But there are also people who are doing more than us, and we can set ourselves against them.
Okay. In your book, you mentioned the dichotomy in access to justice when it comes to class conflicts, such as those between maids or servants and employers or masters. And the recent violence in Noida over the alleged abuse of a maid for allegedly stealing money from her employer's home, it rings a bell. And what is your takeaway from that violent incident? And do you think a change is coming in a sense? What do you make of this whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, I was obviously watching it from afar. I thought a lot of different things. I mean, I know that the fact that it's been sort of verified on both sides, and both sides have told a very different story, which I think invariably happens that employers and the help. What one side says and what the other side says doesn't seem to have any resemblance. But I did think two things. It doesn't happen so often that that people who work for a wealthier colony or complex, they rise up and storm it. And that usually happens when things have come to a head, or there have been long simmering resentments. And so whether or not it was, whether or not whoever was in the right in this case, there has to have been something going wrong for some time for people to really take such a drastic step. Because particularly the way the papers are covering it, wouldn't be covering it if it happened all the time in that same way. So it's obviously created a lot of surprise. And when people are doing something unusual, it's worth thinking that they have probably, this is sort of something has brought things to a head.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is that, again, I don't know what happened in this particular case, but I don't think it's so unbelievable that an employer, if they think their maid has stolen from them, that they would hit her or threaten her, or maybe keep her, not allow her to go home, thinking that this is something they can do. And these things do happen. Whether they happen in this case, I don't know, but they have happened. They do happen.
Okay. So we've spoken a lot about the problems at hand and the issues with the sector. So I must now ask you, what do you think is the way forward, and what do you think should be done for a better working and living condition for maids in India?
So I think there's a sort of, all of the answers I have are unfortunately really kind of long term and maybe bureaucratic. I do think one part of it is just the way we think about status. And I'm sure you might agree that India is really a country where we have so many divisions of hierarchy, right? Like parents and their children, men, women, rich and poor, tribal, non-tribal, and people in those different situations have very different ideas about what they owe and what they owe someone else. But those are feelings and ways of behaving that take a really long time to change, and I think. I'm not so sure where that change comes from, but I do think one thing that would really be helpful is for there to be laws that lay out, what is the wage, for how many hours, if there's a belief that the theft has occurred, how should it be handled, what are the protections owed both to the employer and to the employee in that situation, so that it doesn't become some kind of a coercion situation.
Okay.
And I know everybody says that in India we follow the laws, but if you at least have a law, you can know what's right and wrong. Otherwise, you won't know that.
Okay. And finally, I mean, there's a very interesting point you make in your book. I thought it was a little bit of trivia, sort of. You mentioned that currently childcare is where the money is at, and the domestic service sector has adapted very cleverly to this new need among double-income urban couples. In your research, what other such adaptations did you find of this sector over the years to the needs of the market?
So I do think, I think the ad that I saw, which was actually not in Delhi but in Bangalore, and somebody was asking for almost like a house manager. They were saying, I want someone who knows how to cook, who can order and plan a menu for a dinner of 10 people and do this without my sort of involvement because I'm a busy single executive. I think it was a woman who had placed that ad. So I think I think that people who can sort of run a house and pay bills and do things without intervention in a household where there are two couples, I bet that they can actually afford to be paid, asked to be paid more. And then of course childcare, where somebody's English speaking, I think is definitely going to be something that will allow people to be paid very well going forward.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I mean, not at
Oh, sorry. No, continue, please. Okay, well, thank you, Tripti, so much for joining in. And thank you all for tuning in as well. Have a nice day.